Hello, I'm Shelly Kramer, and welcome to this episode of the Futurum Tech Webcast. This show is part of our Cybersecurity Shorts Series, and I am thrilled today to have two repeat guests on the show and two people who are as much cybersecurity nerds as I am. And I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation around sort of, talking about what's going on in the industry, what we're seeing from a cybersecurity standpoint, what businesses need to think about, and all of that sort of thing. So without further ado, I'll introduce my guests, John Boyle and Rick Martinez from Dell Technologies. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks, Shelly.
Oh, thank you.
Always great to have you. And with that, I've just touched on who you are. Why don't you both tell us just a little bit about yourselves and sort of your journey to where you ended up today at Dell Technologies with what you're working on. So Rick, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Rick Martinez. I'm a senior distinguished engineer. I work in Dell's Experience and Innovation Group. So we're a CTO group in our client PC division. And I'm personally responsible for our security strategy for our PCs. And I generally look, as a CTO group, we generally look 3 to 5 years out on our strategy. So always looking forward into the future at what our adversaries are going to be up to in 3 to 5 years. I've been at Dell close to 25 years, and half of those years I've been focused on security. I like to tell people that I've kind of worked my way up the stack, though. I actually joined Dell as an intern in college, and I never looked back. But I started by designing motherboards. Then I moved into the BIOS team because it was a lot easier to iterate on writing code than it was to scrap motherboards. And then, eventually as a BIOS engineer and BIOS lead, I found security, and it was really an amazing journey since then, right? So over the past 10, 15 years, the security industry on PC specifically has just made some huge strides, and I've been lucky to be a part of that, and really interesting work, and hopefully contribute to that over the next 10 years or so.
Yeah, I think that I have 15-year-old twin high school sophomores, and one of the bits of gospel that I find myself regularly preaching is, the best career is one where you end up, truly excited every day to get up and do the things that you want to get to do and need to do, and with your organization, with your clients. And that's how I feel a lot about just the technology space in general, but certainly with a focus on security, because it has never been a more fundamental piece of business strategy than it is today, and that is in no way going to change ever. So I think that's part of what jazzes me so much about it. John, let's hear your backstory.
Well, been at the Dell for, I think, a combined, I'd probably say 8 or 9 years, but I'm what they call a boomeranger. I was there I was here for about 5 years, and then went to work for a small startup, and then got pulled right back into to work in the security team. I'm a product manager in cybersecurity. I closely partner with Rick and the CTO team, because our focus is to bring that 4 or 5 year roadmap and North Star vision into the 1-3 year, and develop solutions with our hardware and firmware and BIOS teams and the software to execute on that. And also, to be able to be agile enough to respond to market dynamics. And boy, this year has been dynamic. I started off at Oracle out of school. I was the first Sun Solaris support rep when the company was only $700 million annually, and been through a lot of phases in technology, and really enjoy it. And security's always been an attribute of everything that I've done, but I'm really thrilled to focus on security 100% of the time, because it is very important. The way that we get to interact with so many of our customers, that it impacts so many people around the globe,
Right.
and then their security missions to support is very exciting, and something that we're very passionate about doing.
Absolutely. Well, security around the globe is a very big deal. And, I feel like, and I know that we've had this conversation before, these days when you're talking about cybersecurity, it's kind of like playing a game of whack-a-mole. What's next? We have the Colonial Pipeline, we have JBS Foods, just in the last just in the last week, we've had the new cooperative hack, which is, the cybercrime cell Black Matter, a Russian group, executed a ransomware attack on the new cooperative, and this is a grain co-op, and these are. And so when you think about supply chain, and you think about all of these different things that target supply chain, this particular hack, the new cooperative hack. The hackers are demanding 5.9 million to unlock the computer networks that New Cooperative uses to keep the food supply chains and the feeding schedules on track for millions of chickens and cows and hogs. And that may not be, it's kind of like the Colonial Pipeline. Again, we don't, sometimes when we think of infrastructure, we think of utilities and that sort of thing. But there's a whole lot of infrastructure that can be impacted, and that certainly is being targeted by threat actors the world over. So it really is a really big challenge.
Right.
Yeah. So let's talk about, so we've had these major attacks. Let's talk about, what have the trends that we've seen since, the new cooperative hack is a brand new one, right? But let's think about Colonial Pipeline, JBS Foods. What have we seen since these attacks have happened in the industry?
I think as far as when you mentioned supply chain, I'll just kick it off in the higher level. Supply chain to us, is from the moment that our parts source to the point where a device retires. And so, supply chain can be physical, it can be digital, it can be the people working on things. And when we talk about the supply chain of these different industries, and we call them critical infrastructure,
Right.
Healthcare, financial services, our food supply, because if something's impacted, yes, the data is ransomed. Yes, it has an impact financially to the company. But as we'll talk about later in one of the specific examples we want to discuss today, it has impact to real lives. And so what we've seen is a response from governments around the world, and we specifically with that executive order from the US federal, from President Biden's desk, speaking to the importance of the federal government's leaning into protecting critical infrastructure. And that's been a very, very big shift, and it's had a few ripple effects. The first one I would say is that it has drawn attention to security from being just a nice to have checkbox. I got a product that has some security, to a primary strategic, imperative when looking at your ecosystem and how your organizations work. The second thing is that it's drawn attention to the large attacks. And so I believe what we're seeing now is that the drift is that the attacks are focusing on smaller, softer targets. And so the message I would say, and I think that Rick might agree, is that everybody's a target, and everybody needs to do that proactive assessment of their security posture.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Rick? What do you think?
Yeah, I agree, and I think anyone will agree that a lot of these are critical infrastructure, but it hasn't been. Luckily, it hasn't been widespread and kind of national impact yet.
Right.
I think that
keyword.
Yeah, exactly, and that's where I was going. So I think that it is actually I'm not going to say it's a good thing, but it is certainly a catalyst for change and a catalyst for investing in the right software, in the right hygiene, and in the right security for everybody, right? So these attackers, if there's any silver lining, they've provided some awareness to this problem. They've provided some incentive for lawmakers to go and try to address this in policy. And certainly they've provided some additional justification for companies that develop security and develop security software and infrastructure to go and go to their budget meetings and really make a difference, right? So I'm trying to be a little bit opportunistic about it, and I hope we can do that. I think the other interesting thing about it, and it's a little bit of an aside, but because of these targets and because of the high visibility of them, there's also kind of this business versus risk kind of a conversation or a decision that happens, right? You've got a lot of companies out there today doing cybersecurity and ransomware insurance. So we're getting to this point where some of these victims are actually paying the ransom because it's a lot cheaper based on their insurance policy than actually going back to their backups or figuring out, how to remediate in some other way. So this gives a pretty obvious advantage to the attackers, which is not something that we want, right? And so I think as system developers and ecosystem security players, I think we can all do a better job on either backups or improving cyber resilience of our platforms and our networks and things like that, so that we can kind of bring that back to in the other direction and away from kind of paying these criminals into actually protecting against this.
Well, and it is completely understandable why somebody would want to just suck it up, pony up the dough, and go on down the road. But the reality of it is, the more that we do that, the more incentivized threat actors are to keep doing that. And
Exactly.
so and this is an incredibly profitable business. I mean, an incredibly profitable business. One of the things, John, you talked about supply chain. I was reading a little bit before this show, some data from the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity. Their research shows that they expect supply chain attacks to quadruple in 2021. Um, we're in 2021, right? And this was an article that was just published this summer, so it was pretty recent. But the other thing that they found that I thought was kind of interesting, that about 66% of supply chain attacks focus on the supplier's code. So, you know, get in there, get access, and we have so much. We've got ransomware as a service offerings. We've got phishing as a service offerings. I mean, all the threat actors are nothing if not entrepreneurial and well aware of how to quickly stand up new business models to just make it easy for anybody who wants to do dirty deeds that much easier. So
Yeah, and I think that what we get often told or we requested of is that
right.
customers more and more tell Rick and I at all levels, CIOs, commercial, government agencies, that they don't know what they don't know. And I think
Right.
that I always say that is a very powerful statement from people that know a lot.
Yeah.
And the
That's
mo
my favorite dadism line to say. I use that all the time.
yeah.
We don't know what we don't know until we know.
I know, or you can really make it elegant and say, well, it's like a Socrates thing where it's true knowledge, you usually know nothing at all. And I think that is the first thing with security, is that reassess the posture,
Yeah.
because to date it could have been like, oh, we bought a product, or I had my parents like, oh, I had the Norton antivirus from 1996 that came in the magazine thing.
Yeah.
And the reality is that when we talk about supply chain security, protecting our digital or physical, we talk about the firmware protections, we talk about above operating system, physical, digital, like we're talking about. It gets down to disruption of a kill chain, because the first thing to know is that people don't just wake up in the morning, stretch and have their coffee and say, oh, I'm going to attack a high value target today. It has to be a successive chain of successful events that are progressed either by holes in the infrastructure, the policy, humans themselves,
Yeah.
that conclude in an attack. And our job is to be as disruptive to that as possible. And it's not a single solution. So there's a
Right.
lot of things that, let's say, we imbue into the Dell devices that, one, we don't really talk about a lot because our customers, are the ones that need to know. And so there's things that below the operating system that talk to things like the threat engines and that sort of thing. So we try to be as highly disruptive as possible. And it could be a small measure. It could be something significant like a XDR solution. But the big message is, one solution is not your silver bullet. You need to have a partner who's your technology partner, your
Right.
security partner, and it needs to be a partnership of trust, so that partner is not just selling you solutions, they're looking out for your specific security mission.
Yeah, and I think that we talk a lot. I just got back from an event in my first business travel event. As a matter of fact, I was moderating some panel discussions in Boston with Dassault Technologies, and one of the things that we were talking about, in as it relates to manufacturing and some of the technologies that they do, is that smart partnerships are everything. And, I think that leaders understanding, whether it's CISOs or CIOs or senior leaders or all of them, that, the days where you can do everything as a self-contained unit are really over. There's so many issues at play here. There's the challenge of the skills gap within organizations. There's the challenge of a dearth of skilled tech talent. And there's the challenge that technology is evolving so quickly and is going to continue to do so. And keeping up is incredibly difficult. So when you're working with strategic partners, what you're getting is somebody who can slide into your organization, work with your team, help you, bring their knowledge base and their expertise to the table. But also, you slide in knowing, we did this, this, and this for the Department of Defense or this company or whatever.
Right.
And so you're able to bring the solutions and even the challenges, that you experienced with other organizations to the table when it comes to helping map out the right strategies, the right equipment, the right hardware, the right software, and I think that understanding that from a business leadership standpoint, and that it's not a failure for you to say, we can't do this all ourselves. It's really the most strategic path I think you can go on.
Right.
Nobody's going to argue with me there. I like that. I like that.
Stellar.
So I want to talk a little bit now about, I'll just touch very quickly. This isn't a question so much as we've got a bunch of things going on at the administrative level with the federal government and beyond. We've got Biden signed an executive order at the end of July designed to protect America's critical infrastructure. And this executive order, John, you touched on it briefly, but I just wanted to map it out a little bit. It requires all government agencies to adopt multi-factor authentication and encryption on data at rest or in transit, which, by the way, is only part of the problem. There is also a directive to develop a nation cloud security strategy that will apply to all agencies. There are standardized contractual requirements for third-party vendors working with each government agency. And oh, by the way, why is this important? The name SolarWinds, right? I mean, technology company with managed services provider with lots of government entities as clients. That was a huge hack that we're still discovering the ramifications of. But so that those contractual requirements for third-party vendors are important. And then each requirement comes with a deadline of between 60 and 180 days of showing the urgency of the situation. And I was reading something the other day about a rating system. And do we have a rating system here in the United States where somebody, where a breach happens and we rate it as a, 8.5? Do we have one of those, Rick? Or is that a European thing?
I've not run across that.
Okay. I didn't think that we did. And I was reading something else. This is what happens when all you do is consume information. But I was reading something else recently about another hack. Just in the last couple of days, I was reading this and they were talking about, the vendor in this situation rated this hack, a severity of, like 8.9, which out of 10. And I think I remember reading that, why don't we have this kind of a reporting system so that vendors can quickly and easily say, we think this is an urgency situation of this. So, but I didn't think we had one of those. We also have, the Department of Homeland Security. They issued a directive in late July requiring owners and operators of TSA designated critical pipelines that transport hazardous liquids and natural gas and required them to implement some urgently needed protections against cyber intrusion. So we do have at the federal level some serious attention. I think they do understand the severity of the problem here. And, I know Biden has had conversations with Putin. I'm sure everybody expects those to be fruitful and for Russia to just do whatever we ask them to do, because isn't that how that works? So anyway, there are a lot of things going on at the federal level, and that's a good thing. But I think that, one of the things that has come out of, we did some research together in the last number of months, John and Rick, and I know we talked about this before, but some of our data during the course of that research showed us that when you ask customers whether or not they've encountered a security breach over the course of the last 6, 9, 12 months, whatever, um, many of them say, yes, absolutely. We've encountered numerous breaches. And the way that they've detected those breaches is that they have a very robust security posture. They're using dashboards that show real time information about what's happening. And they're able to quickly and easily identify anomalies, right? And the people, the people in that study that we did who told us that they were relatively certain they had not experienced any kind of breach were, John, you want to end that sentence for me, because I know you know.
I'm trying to think. I just remember like that people a lot of people were saying they're not sure if they've been breached
Well, they
actually.
don't have, they're not using
Uh,
a dashboard.
Yeah, or they're not
That's it.
using like there's a way to actually have the the network be monitored through
Right.
extended detection and response,
Yeah,
so that and it even gets down to like it's not just the endpoint, it's the servers, it's the networking,
absolutely.
and even those big companies that have those outside HVAC providers that remote control cool their companies from the outside. I mean, those systems have computers too.
Right.
And so everything is kind of a device these days. And so it's having the proactive assessment of what's in your environment, and that's something like VDR is a good example of that, to
Right.
detect like, hey, you have these things in your environment, and a lot of people are probably like, oh, I never knew I had that in my environment. And then how do you do something like pen test to see like where you might have some vulnerabilities proactively, and then how do you set up a posture so that you've got things like next gen antivirus on the computers, and you have the endpoint detection and response, and then the extended detection and response, and do things proactively. And so I think that that's a big step for some people, and it's like, how do I get started? If I'm a small company, what are my choices? If I'm a large company, does that mean that I lose control of my IT stuff? And so I think the thing is, against that partnership discussion around, what's the best fit for your mission and for your organization. But the cool thing is that we also see that a lot of these security offerings out there, XDR is a great example that was mentioned in the executive order, and we'll kind of call that out a little bit later. But if you're a small hospital like my dad's organization, he's running in a rural area. Um, they need to have the enterprise security technology at scale for the price they can afford,
Right.
and they don't want to stand it up in their own network. But
Right.
when he was managing, one of the big ones in the Bay Area, when I was growing up, the big hospitals there, they could stand it up in their environment. So
Right.
really, it's making sure that the technology is available to all companies and all organizations, because everybody's a target, and that's like 50 endpoints, for instance. It's nonprofits, it's anything, because everybody's connected and they're an island hop or two away from another target. So
Yeah. Well, and I think that's also an important takeaway here is that, you don't make the mistake of thinking, if you're a small to mid-sized organization, that solutions are priced out of your budget,
right.
because it's not the case. And it is incredibly important to protect your business, to protect your data, to protect your customers, to protect your employees, all of those things. And I think that a lot of times people think, oh, that's too rich for my blood. But the reality of it is that is incorrect. And there is a solution out there. I think that, will fit organizations of just about every size and every, focus area and everything like that. So I think that's important.
Yeah, and healthcare is a good example. I was talking
Yeah.
to my dad, and traditionally, it's funny. You grow up in a healthcare family. Both my parents are healthcare executives.
Yeah.
Lots of great dinner time conversations. I can't ride a motorcycle growing up, all that kind of stuff. But
Good.
but
Good.
but I was talking to my dad, this last year, and he was, he one thing I'm really proud about my dad, and I'll say that so you can watch this later, is that he is responsible in the Northwest for a lot of the rural satellite clinics,
Yeah.
so that whole access to healthcare out in Eastern Washington and that sort of thing, all the way down in Oregon. That's my dad. He did that when I was growing up, And when you have a diabetes program that's rural in nature and it's deployed out there and everything, it's very important that that keeps functioning. And so
Yeah.
one of the things is that when we talk about the impacts of these attacks, we talk about money, we talk about data, but the real human cost is in a situation like that. I told my dad, I said, the interest and ownership of the security choice and posture has moved from IT to the C level,
Right.
because if those choices that IT makes do not protect the clinic, then your diabetes program is impacted, and so are the lives of your patients. And
Right.
we've seen that this last year. Cancer patients in the East Coast who have had their entire chemotherapy records erased.
Yeah.
My mom was in the hospital this last spring after triple bypass surgery, and I had a lot of time on my hands to sit there and look around at all the. I mean, actually, fortunately, they're using all the Dell technology, which is great to see. But they actually had to open her up in her room in 5 minutes and respond to a blue code. And if that was 20 minutes because somebody's messing around with their network, my mom
Right.
wouldn't be here today. So I
Right.
want to impress upon everybody out there that cold winters, lack of heat, hot summers, lack of AC, lack of food supply chain, lack of healthcare. Those are our global community members' lives at stake. And so there's a very human element to what we are protecting.
Right.
And we don't want to get that lost in the data and the financials.
Yeah, I mean, it's more than just about somebody having your personally identifiable information and, stealing your identity and bringing up I mean, that's
And that's
terrible
bad,
too,
but I think
right?
that
That's
there's
terrible
we're
too.
seeing impacts to
But
people's daily lives. Yeah,
yeah,
that's
and
real.
in many instances, um, healthcare is it's probably, I think, the number one target. And it's easy. And a lot of times their systems are outdated. Their IT practices are outdated. A global pandemic has presented a perfect opportunity because hospitals are already, overloaded and inundated. And you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's like,
Yep.
and that's the other thing to
And
think
they're all
about.
connected too, by the way. So your
Yeah.
small clinic in the rural area is
Mhm.
connected to the network, and doctors
Yeah.
have a privilege at a bigger clinic or a
Yeah.
university where they teach. And and they have all the disparate databases and everything. So
Yeah.
it's a great example, and that's something that we all experience a healthcare event, and we all know somebody this
Yeah.
last 2 years who has. But
Yeah.
interestingly enough, security is like healthcare. So, do you get more benefit out of having a preventative visit every year to detect something early,
Yeah.
or do you wait for the major medical event because you didn't take proactive measures?
Right.
And that's what security is, and that's what we're trying to do is put that annual visit, the proactive measures in place so that companies don't have a major medical event in their infrastructure. It's a good
Well, and
analogy, really.
And I'll qualify that by saying that it's, and I'm reasonably certain our audience would not think this, but I just want to make sure. We do not mean that this is a one time, that an annual security checkup is
Yeah,
good
it's
enough, because it's
ongoing.
not. It's not. And, I just wrote about phishinware as a service. Um, uh, that was just discovered actually by some Microsoft researchers recently, and their whole job is around looking for vulnerabilities and problems. And they happen to discover this ransomware, not ransomware, phishing as a service operation that was happening. And, the way that they discovered it was not fixing a problem. It was just saying, this is our job here. This is what we're going to look for.
Yep.
And so, I know that you do that as well. And it's just across the board, it is a regular, continuous, ongoing focus on never, ever really letting your finger off of the control panel, right? I mean, it really is such a critical part of operations. One thing I'd like to talk a little bit more about too, a little bit about in general, because we really haven't touched on it. And I did kind of laugh about it when we were talking about protect data protection and things like that. Rick, we're hearing a lot about zero trust being the right security posture for the future. Talk with us a little bit about zero trust. Maybe give us some examples, give us your thoughts on, what that is and why it's important.
Sure. So I really like that you referenced zero trust as a security posture and not a product, right?
Yeah.
So we see that misused so much in this industry, right? Everybody's trying to I'm sure if there was an RSA conference in person this year, there would have been, every booth would have said zero trust on it, right?
Right.
So it's getting a lot of attention as a buzzword, right? And it's marketing teams are going for it, and that's great, and that's what they do.
Right.
But for us in security, right, it's been part of our fundamentals for many years, right? And instead of saying zero trust these days because it's overused and it's lost its meaning as a buzzword, I like to dig down one level deeper and just say never trust and always verify, right?
Yeah.
And that's much more specific. It's much more actionable. It gets away from kind of the negative connotations of zero trust as a buzzword. But that's how I talk about it. And we've been doing that for years, right? Especially on the client side or PC client side where we work. And again, being a CTO team on my side, we've been kind of preparing for this zero trust future for many, many years. And I'm glad that we're finally here, right? So you want to verify things, right? We have safe bias verification. We can verify the bias on your system using off-host measurements, right? That verification can then be used in a policy in a zero trust architecture to determine whether or not the user is allowed to authenticate or whether the network is safe, right? So these things were already built into our systems, and it's really just about connecting these into solutions that implement that zero trust architecture or philosophy even, right? So like I said, everything that we've done over the last decade has also been around hardening our devices, just general hardening and resilience of the device itself, right? So in a zero trust architecture, you're really dependent on that device, that either mobile device or PC or server, they have to be trusted. Otherwise, you don't have anything to go and verify all of these zero trust policies and authentication authorization capabilities, right? So that kind of establishes the PCs and the hardware and even below the operating system as critical components in some of these architectures, right?
Absolutely.
Yep, and I think that's zero trust comes into play with the people who are accessing the network as well as the devices accessing the network. New things that are put into the environment. So it could be networking or servers like we talked about. It could be that HVAC system. Everything you need to verify to make sure that that piece of equipment or technology is as intended versus toting along something else that shouldn't be there. And so when Rick talks about our devices with the BIOS verification or our advanced secure component verification, that these components, that the BIOS, and even with Dell's new technology that will verify the boot subregions of the Intel ME, which is first in industry. We are really again imbuing in the device the ability to enforce zero trust, but also linking the devices to the Splunk SIMs so that the SOCs can see the telemetry from below the OS, as well as things like endpoint solutions and XDR. We have integrations so that those threat engines are absorbing the telemetry, and like a Dell device not only is secure in its own right, but adds to the value and the visibility of your full security posture, where traditionally you'll have blind spots because other devices don't do that.
Right. Absolutely. So I want to wrap up our conversation here. We spent a lot of time discussing, what's happened in the last few months, last year or two. I want to shift the conversation a little bit to the future. And I want to talk about, how businesses, what they can do now to protect themselves, and what are some of the key technologies that can be adopted that'll make a difference. And I know that, that Dell has some products that are really interesting. So I'd love it if we could talk about, as I said, what can businesses do now to protect themselves, and then maybe tie that to some of the device offerings or the product offerings that you all have.
Maybe Rick, you want to talk about the below, and I'll cover above the
Sure.
OS.
Great.
Yeah. So from below the OS perspective, right, we're continuously integrating new capabilities below the operating system. We've had hardware root of trust and BIOS signing and signature verification on the BIOS for almost a decade now. Now we're building on top of that foundation and creating sensors and sensor frameworks to be able to understand when some of that has possibly gone wrong, right? If you had a physical attacker on your network or on your device, possibly tamper with your BIOS, we can detect that now, right? In several different ways, either through chassis intrusion or through verification of the BIOS itself. So that kind of creates the foundation of the security for the rest of the stuff to build upon. Another thing that we do is, as far as user authentication goes, going back to kind of those zero trust architectures, and knowing that your user is there, and knowing that your user is authentic and authorized, right? We have something called Safe ID, which is a hardware enforced and backed security chip on the motherboard on our notebook systems. So that allows users to use fingerprint, smart cards, and other advanced authentication techniques in their infrastructure.
Does that have does that Face ID as well?
Face ID goes through our camera and typically through Windows Hello. It's not built into that chip, but fingerprint and other bio factors are.
Well, I mentioned my teenage daughters earlier, and their Dell computer, their Dell laptops have Face ID. So I like that. Fingerprints, good too. So, so I didn't mean to derail you. Had you finished covering these things?
Yeah, and then as John mentioned, I think the other thing that we can do below the operating system is from a supply chain verification perspective, right? Making sure that we have technologies in the factory to create a digital certificates of the system as it's manufactured. That digital certificate can then be used, on the loading dock or in our customer's infrastructure to verify that all the components are there and they haven't been modified or removed or replaced in any way. Mm-hmm. So I think that's, again, those types of below the operating system capabilities, they create a foundation for, the above the OS solutions to build on top of.
Absolutely.
Right. And then in extending that to the above the OS, we talk about that. We talk about solutions that, Dell offers, such as, carbon black endpoint detection and response, NGAV. One of the big topics, especially after that executive order, is XDR, the extended detection and response. And so that's a real interesting one, because through our partnership with SecureWorks, we are able to help customers use XDR in their environment, with not just Dell devices, but anything else they have, because it's actually relevant to the devices that are in the environment. And there's a couple choices there, because we can help big corporations or big organizations deploy and stand up the environment so they can do the monitoring and the threat monitoring themselves. And so that's more of one of our services that we can provide, that consultation. But we're finding that really popular is Dell Managed Detection and Response, because that is a solution that brings the power of XDR to companies of all sizes around the globe, that might have 50 endpoints or 50,000 and have that same level of technology, because we're no longer in the world of that, there's no XDR light for a small business.
Right.
The technology is the same and it scales the same. Right. And you have the expertise of the Dell SOC and the team watching and monitoring the environment 24/7. So you have that technology partnership. And so I just think that the MDR, in the example of my dad's clinic, again, that rural clinic that he's managing now, it's a great fit for Dell MDR, because they can immediately get started and have that rural organization protected. Whereas when he was at the big California network and hospital, they could use Dell MDR, or they could have Dell services stand up XDR in their environment. And so the neat thing there is that you get a full view of what's in your environment, and you may not know some things that are there.
Right.
And then you're immediately monitoring and protecting them, and the system is learning from the events that happen. Like you said, there's things that happen at 8 a.m. every day when the IT people show up, and there's things that are anomalies. And the way we have the Dell devices integrated, it's learning from the Dell devices as a unique add value from Dell. And anybody that's using ServiceNow or Splunk, those investments are protected. So fantastic opportunity to really, get an inquiry about Dell partnering on technology and security with Dell Managed Detection and Response.
Yeah.
And Rick and I are heavily involved with that. So always happy to answer questions.
Well, absolutely. And so in our show notes, I'll be sure and include a link to each of your LinkedIn profiles, so that not that anybody wouldn't be able to find you anyway, but sometimes I try to make it easy as possible. Well, gentlemen, as always, it has been a fantastic conversation, and one that I'm sure we could go on for hours, because that's who we are. right?
Thanks, Shelly.
But absolutely, absolutely. So anyway, this wraps up our Cybersecurity Shorts webcast series interview with my wonderful guests, Rick Martinez and John Boyle from Dell Technologies. And again, if you have any questions after listening to the show, I'll include contact information in there. And gentlemen, thank you as always for spending your time and sharing your gray matter with me and our audience. It's always appreciated and it's always interesting.
Thanks for having us.
Thank
All
you.
right.